Hi, I want to make a video on the subject of making logical disconnections when you're making arguments between what you believe and what you argue. Sort of like I've mentioned before, cause and effect, things like that, and how you have certain ways of understanding things and arguing things. So when you're arguing something, you argue from a point of view that's completely disconnected from the ideas that you logically understand to be true, at least subconsciously. I've mentioned this before, that you know cause and effect exists, but you have an argument about something that's predicated upon, say, something like cause and effect, yet you completely ignore your knowledge and at least understanding of that subject and how it exists in reality, and you completely ignore it in the context it has in the thing that you're arguing, and you completely shut that thing away, and you decide that it has no importance to the relevant argument that has to do with proving someone wrong, that's proving the points that it's predicating upon to exist, and yet you're denying that even though you understand it to be true, and you can't deny it to be true. And it's one of the things that's obviously one of the biggest disconnections in how you have to get to an argument. In many cases, it's because of denial, and I've mentioned this before. It is, in many cases, trying to get to someone emotionally. And if you can't get to someone emotionally, they're going to deny it in the face of every fact you can throw in their face, regardless of how obvious it may be to them or anyone else in reality. Just whatever it is, it can be as obvious as the sky is blue, and blue is blue in its description. It doesn't matter how you say this is synonymous with this, A equals A. It doesn't matter. You're going to have to get to them. And they're just going to say, glibly, throw it to the side and throw it to the sidelines like it doesn't mean anything, even though it means something. It means something regardless. And it's something that exists in reality regardless of what someone wants to believe or doesn't want to believe. And it's just a matter of getting to someone. And I guess it really boils down to getting to someone emotionally more than anything, because emotions are the driving force behind many people's acceptance of reality and what they decide, in many cases, decide to believe in. And if they decide to believe in something that's false, regardless of all the facts, like I mentioned before, be predicated on an argument that has to do with something, accepting a starter, and as opposed to a non-starter. You accept something as a premise to an argument, and on both sides you have to argue, at least around the subject. And if you decide to completely ignore it and change the very foundation of the argument, you're not going to be getting anywhere. You're going to be arguing in both directions, almost to your own subjective values. In many cases, you have to predicate it upon a fact of which you can both agree on, and understand that that's something that you have to argue about in the context, in the same context, in the context of understanding exactly where you're coming from. And if you can't do that, then you're going to be in trouble, because you're not going to be going anywhere. And since there's no foundation, you're not going to be going anywhere with the argument. So if you're not going anywhere with the argument, then I don't see the point in doing anything that's, having the argument to begin with. So it's one of those things where you have to understand exactly where you're coming from on both sides, at least to a certain degree, to at least common denominator when it comes to something like arguing a point. And if you're arguing a point, it has to be understood on both sides. And it's about making the connection between understanding exactly what's going on. And if you don't know exactly what's going on, then you're not going to get anywhere in the argument. Sort of like where I'm going right now, not getting really anywhere in the video, just redundantly saying the same thing over and over again. But yeah, I mean, the basic idea, the basic point is making those logical disconnections, and almost in a way becoming aware of the entire idea of what's going on when someone does something like that. So if someone's doing something like that, you have to recognize where they're coming from. And where they're coming from is not necessarily pointing the facts out to them and doing it maliciously, and on top of that, it's about proving them and getting to them emotionally and saying, almost using subtle forms of language to get to them, such as, oh, you're not that stupid. But making light of it in this video may, almost in a way, if anyone watches it, make them become a little more self-aware. Maybe not for the more negative. If I make light of it and they recognize it, they either deny it or they accept it. And the acceptance of it, if they deny it, then it's going to come back and bite them in the ass later, and they're not going to accept it, and then it's going to come back and bite them and become even just as much more strong than it would have to begin with. Or if they accept it, it's either going to let them become more self-aware of what they're actually believing, or it's going to have them use it as a better defense mechanism. It's going to strengthen their convictions, and they're going to realize how subtle you are, and they're going to use that subtlety not necessarily against you, but they're going to use it as a form of self-defense, like, oh, I knew you were going to use that subtle language to get to me. And they're going to be more aware of the exactly what's going on, or they're going to have it become more aware of the argument themselves and become more open to the idea of some kind of argument that means something in the end. So it's one of those things that I guess in many circumstances can be useful, in many cases it can be detrimental. But then again, it's obviously one of those things we can't necessarily figure out until it's one of those things that we can obviously use against someone in an argument or understanding where we're coming from, because it does require a starter of an argument, a premise. And we can't be completely bogged down by a bunch of non-starters that don't go anywhere when it comes to arguing some kind of factual existence or proving a point using emotions or whatever. In many cases, you have to bog down or go down to that level to prove a point. And in many cases, that's the only really good and decent way to get the job done. But in many cases, you need to rely on emotions and use that against someone in an argument, because there's no other real way to get to them, because it got to them emotionally, and it's already sunk in so much emotionally, since their convictions now are emotional and they weren't relying upon facts. Unless they are, then facts in many cases will work better. But if it's relying on emotion in many cases, and they've been brainwashed, and in many cases growing up that's how it's usually fed into them, emotions and abuse or whatever it may be, you're going to have to emotionally suck that out of them, vacuum it out of them. Otherwise, it's not going to be something you're going to get to them with. It needs a vacuum, a suction, all those things out. In many cases, emotions are what you need to get to in the argument, not facts. And facts, you can sprinkle them in there, sort of like the subtlety of saying it's easy to understand this thing. You need to sprinkle the facts in there, but in many cases, you need to find a way to emotionally make someone vulnerable to the idea and the point that you're trying to get across more than anything else. And if you can't do that, then you're kind of stuck in a situation where you're going to have to be very clever in your acknowledgement of exactly what's going on in an argument to prove a point. In many cases, it takes the smart person to prove this wrong person wrong. And just because the smart person, the one that's on the right side, or at least closer to the right side, gets off on it, doesn't mean it's a wrong thing. It's about proving people wrong. And in many cases, if it gets, you feel good about it, that just comes extra with proving the person wrong and making the world a better place. At least in acknowledging the truth and making it better, generally speaking, for everyone else, as far as we can tell at this moment. Knowing the truth and accepting the truth is less detrimental than not accepting the truth at all. So it's one of those things you just have to do. Otherwise, it's not going to be, you're never going to really know. And it's better to accept the truth and use that as a starting off point and trying to make better, even if it did get worse, and acknowledging the truth, because it ruined everyone else's convictions and what they believed in and their happiness. But it's better to start off with that blank, template or plate than to start off with a bunch of lies. And obviously, once you get to the truth, the only thing that's going to be there is lies in the way. But once you know the truth, the lies are going to be harder to penetrate to the person that knows the truth. So it's about understanding and making these value judgments and recognizing exactly what's going on. Otherwise, you're not going to be getting anywhere. But obviously, that's the point. It's going to be a dead end anyway. When you recognize the truth, it's going to be a dead end that you're going to be reaching in the end anyway. So, yes, I used cause and effect as an example. Obviously, you need to understand something along those lines. Cause and effect, I understand that. But then completely ignoring that and proving your point, realizing the point you're trying to make and the argument you have right now is completely contradicting the fact that something like cause and effect or interaction exists, and how it's going to be predetermined, and it's only predetermined once it's already existed. Once it's already happened. It hasn't happened until it happened, but it's going to happen a certain way based on the events right now and in the past leading up to that point in the future. So it's about understanding these premises and knowing exactly where you're going with them. And then starting off with a premise that we can both agree upon, at least close enough that you know where exactly you're going in an argument. Otherwise, you're going to be stuck and going nowhere. So, at least, you're just going to be going in the figure 8 sign. You're going to be going in circles. And that's not going to be doing you or anyone else any good, because it's only going to be tiring you of the argument over and over again and making the argument seem less, not necessarily valid, but less powerful or less meaningful and more mundane and redundant. It's about getting over that hurdle and making sure that the point gets across as thoroughly and as understandably as possible. And obviously getting to the motions more than anything if you realize the facts aren't good enough to prove a person wrong. So obviously that's something you need to do. It's something you need to do to make a point, get across very well. So yes, I think that's all I want to make. I want to make all these videos 10 minutes or less to get the point across and be as poignant as possible. So thank you, and if I have anything else to mention on the subject, there's always another video to make on the subject. At least add it in. So see you next time. Bye.